There was the 1-2 punch of the Patterson-Gimlin film and then the legend of Boggy Creek. And I can't tell you how many Bigfoot investigators I know that, that's when they really became interested. Me as well. So I do admittedly have a bad habit of taking surveys when I'm doing my talks because I like to gauge where the general populace, where they stand in terms of a lot of this subject matter. So I'm going to ask you please, by show of hands, how many of you associate the Fouke monster with Bigfoot? Thank you. Okay, otherwise I was going to be kind of awkward up here, but yeah, I think most of us feel like even though they don't really say Bigfoot, I don't think they say Bigfoot at all in the Legend of Boggy Creek, but that was the inference. And really the significance of the Legend of Boggy Creek is that Bigfoot Sasquatch was always viewed as a Pacific Northwest phenomenon. And then the Legend of Boggy Creek came out and people began to realize, well, wait a minute, maybe Bigfoot is in the eastern United States as well, which is pretty amazing. But anyways, my presentation today is going to be, this is my upcoming book. It's going to be out in September. It's called The Essential Guide to Bigfoot. And the reason I decided to write this book is that traveling around the country and doing lectures and meeting people, I find that there's a newer generation of Bigfoot enthusiasts. However, a lot of those folks, I kind of call them the Finding Bigfoot generation because they've kind of lost track with a lot of the older foundational information, which is very important. Now, I don't pretend to be the ultimate expert on Bigfoot. Truth be told, there really are no experts, right, since we don't have a type specimen. But I have been interested in Bigfoot for about 40 years. I've been researching it. I've traveled all over. I've investigated Bigfoot from Alaska to Central America. I'm greatly honored to be friends and colleagues with most of the top Bigfoot investigators in the field, and so I've learned a lot from them as well. So we're going to talk about some of the foundational information, and I think it's very important that those of us that, let me ask you something else. How many people here think Bigfoot exists? It's okay if you're a skeptic. There's nothing wrong. Okay, so guys, you and I are the 20%. What I mean by that is that based on polling, only about 20% of the population thinks that Bigfoot exists. 80% of the people out there, they may like Bigfoot, but they view it as a fun legend and mystery and just part of our culture, but not a bona fide animal. So we're all in the 20% here. And I'm sure all of you, when you bring up Bigfoot with some of your friends and colleagues, you get funny looks. Well, hopefully I'm going to empower you guys today with a little bit of information that's going to help you, explain your position and why, Bigfoot might in fact exist. But here we go. This is going to be, all right, so another show of hands, please. How many people think that the Patterson-Gimlin film is authentic? It shows an actual Bigfoot? Okay, good. So in that respect, Patty becomes our archetype, right? Probably the best photographic evidence we have of a Bigfoot or a Sasquatch, so we can certainly learn a lot from Patty and from the related evidence. Okay, so these are the main characteristics of Bigfoot that we can all agree on, of course. It's a human-like form. It walks upright on 2 legs. It's bipedal. It has sturdy legs. It has a proportionally longer, straighter leg, longer arms, and it walks with a cross-limb coordination, swinging arms. That's the really startling thing about Bigfoot to most people, is that it looks so human-like. Sorry, this is kind of ringing up a little bit. Check, 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 check. Okay. So it looks very much like us, which is very surprising and startling to a lot of people. Body mostly covered in hair, and again, using Patty as an archetype here, most witnesses have described the hair as being, or the face as being mostly hairless. Oh no, my laser just broke. Darn, someone get me a laser. Okay, no, it's okay. People say that the palms of the hands, the soles of the feet are hairless, but basically the body is covered in hair from head to foot. Gigantic stature, and I'm gonna circle back around in a moment. We're gonna talk about how gigantic, because there's a lot of different opinions on that. The most oft-reported characteristic with regard to Bigfoot are extremely broad shoulders, about 15 or 20% broader than a human's. And almost every Bigfoot sighting you report, they always say it had these massive shoulders, And additionally, people describe it as having apparently no neck or very huge trapezius muscles to where it looks like the head is sitting right on the shoulders, right? No one ever reports a Bigfoot's neck. And then the second most oft-reported feature of Bigfoot is many people say that the arms look longer than a human's, proportionally longer, maybe down to the knee. Some of that may be because they supposedly walk kind of stooped over and lift their legs rather high, so and also the shoulders very broad. So those are our characteristics. By the way, this is of course a frame, the famous frame from the Patterson film, frame 352, and this is a red filter produced by M.K. Davis, and he uses a number of filters to bring out detail, so you might be able to see a little bit of detail in there that we don't normally see. Okay, so how big does Bigfoot really get? So this is where I'm going to turn this into like a mini game show. So I'm going to ask people to raise their hands if you want to guess what the consensus opinion is. How tall is Patty in the Patterson film? Anyone want to guess? 7'6"? Yes, sir. Very good. 7'3" is the consensus. Is that what you're going to say too? 7'9"? Okay, so you see there's a lot of opinion. Okay, a word on where we collected our data. The best data that we have for Bigfoot are the broad database of sightings and accounts. This was started by the great John Green back in the 1950s, and he collected up to 1,500 or 2,000 credible accounts. There was also researchers like Peter Byrne with the Bigfoot Research Project collecting numbers of accounts. And then in this century, it's been groups like the Bigfoot Field Research Organization and NAWAC and other groups that have created databases. So we literally have thousands of Bigfoot sightings that we can compile. And there have been some academics who've taken large numbers of these Bigfoot sightings, put them into computers, and done different types of statistical analysis. So that's how a lot of the things I talk about are become consensus opinions. Now, in terms of the Patterson film, there are a few academics that actually did very in-depth scientific analysis of the Patterson film, and the way they were able to guesstimate Patty's height was by the footprints that were left behind that were cast by Roger Patterson, Bob Gimlin, Bob Titmus. And you can see the bottom of Patty's feet in the film. So we know that Patty's foot is 14.5 inches long. So some academics have used that as a scale to reconstruct. Also, John Green in 1967 or 68, a few months after the Patterson film, had Jim McLaren, a 6'5" guy, walk the same trajectory. And you can overlay those two. There are also objects in the Patterson-Gimlin film that were verified later, things like tree stumps, dead trees, and things that different people could use to kind of gauge. So there have been a number of academic studies, and the consensus opinion is that Patty is 7 feet 3 inches tall. That figure was physical anthropologist Dr. Jeff Meldrum, a forensic film analyst from Washington State named Jeff Glickman, Bill Munns, special effects expert, a number of Bigfoot researchers that I respect, like John Kirk and Daniel Perez. They all say 7'3". This is the best guess on how tall Patty was. Now, what is the significance of that? Well, if Patty is 7'3", doesn't it make it harder to explain as a guy in a costume? Would everyone agree with me that? It's a lot harder to find guys that are 7'3" to put on a costume, correct? Now, 7'3" is the consensus, but there is a little bit of disagreement. John Green thought it was 6'6", based on his reenactment. He thought 6'6" was more appropriate. The great late Dr. Grover Krantz, physical anthropologist from Washington State, thought 6'6". And Cliff Barrickman thinks 6'5". He thinks Bigfoots are smaller in general. And he's in good company because a primatologist from England named Donald Grieve also guessed 6'5". So there's a little bit of range there, but 7'3" is still the consensus opinion. So it's important that we know that. Now, most hominoids are sexually dimorphic. Hominoids, of course, are the great family that includes us, as well as all of the great apes, and also all of the pre-human hominoid forms that evolved in Africa and Asia over the past few million years. Dimorphic means when you have a species where the males and females in that species have different characteristics. So in terms of hominoids, which is us and gorillas and orangutans and other great apes, the males are always 15 to 20% larger than the females, at least. In some cases, it's much greater. For example, in gorillas, the males can be twice as big as the females, and in orangutans, same thing. So knowing that, if we assume that Patty is obviously a female, right? We see that she has breasts in the film. We assume she's full grown, 7'3". So if Patty's a full-grown adult, then that brings up an interesting question. How big do the males get? Does anybody want to take a guess? How big do they think Bigfoot gets? 8.5? It's fair. Anyone else want to take a guess? Over 9 foot, you think? Okay. This is all speculation, and this is based on all of the eyewitness accounts that have been crunched and analyzed. In my own personal opinion, I think 9 feet is the very tallest that a Bigfoot can get. I think that would be a huge full-grown male. I think actually that 8 to 8.5 feet is a more commonly reported size. John Green, when he analyzed 1,500 sightings back in the 70s, found that 7.5 feet was the average size for a Sasquatch that's reported. Now, we have to acknowledge it is very hard to estimate height on something, particularly when we're scared and shaking in our boots. And I use this as an analogy. I once got to meet the basketball legend Akeem Olajuwon, who stands about 7 feet tall. And standing next to him, guys, I honestly couldn't have guessed how tall he was. He might have looked much taller than 7 feet to me. He was just huge. So it is hard to guesstimate, but if you look at all the sightings and accounts, 7.5 is the average height that's estimated for a Sasquatch, and I think personally that 9 feet is as tall as they can get. If they get taller than 9 feet, or presumably people that say they get taller than 9 feet, it creates a lot of problems from a biological perspective. All animals have different adaptations that are ideally suited so that they can thrive in their environment. When you talk about a hominid or a hominoid standing 10, 12, 15 feet tall, it doesn't make any sense. There's no benefit for a Bigfoot to be that tall. It would make it harder for it to move through the forest. It would be more easily seen, and it also would create structural issues. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the story of the tallest man that ever lived, Robert Wadlow. He was 8'11". Well, he died prematurely because he had so much trouble walking, right? So, and obviously Sasquatches are better walkers than we are, and we can talk about that. So based on the height estimates, there have also been some scientific studies done to estimate the volume, and there's an equation that says basically as the height doubles, the volume is cubed or triples. So in that respect, looking at the Patterson film, Dr. Grover Krantz as well as Dr. Henner Fehrenbach both estimated that Patty weighs about 500 to 546 pounds. Those are the estimates. So we think females probably weigh about 500 pounds, and the males, if they stand about 8 or 9 feet tall, probably weigh anywhere from 800 to 1,000 pounds. So again, this is kind of our position right now as far as how big they get. Okay, so let's talk about some of the other features of Bigfoots or Sasquatches that are important. What color are they? Anyone want to take it? This is obviously a pretty wide open question, but all right, we'll just cut to the jib here. And again, this is John Green that did his own computer study in the late 70s, and also a research biologist named Dr. Henner Fehrenbach at the Oregon Primate Research Center took about 1,350 of John Green's sightings and also sightings from Peter Burns' database and other researchers, and crunched them together to make bell curves and graphs. And this is what both men came up with. In terms of descriptions of Bigfoot, and I'm sorry, am I standing in front of anyone here? 55% roughly of people describe the Bigfoots they see as being black or dark. And dark could include like dark brown. 30%, about a third, describe brown color, like a lighter brown. And many people, interestingly enough, describe reddish brown. You'll hear that commonly. Well, it's kind of a reddish brown color. It was brown, but it had a reddish tinge. Sasquatch hairs that have been studied and analyzed by Dr. Henner Fehrenbach, he's got at least a dozen, are all red under the microscope. They have a very reddish color. And then 15% would be other colors, and of course that would be like gray, blonde, white. You know, we've heard of those accounts, but they're much more rare. What do their faces look like? This is probably the most subjective question with regard to Bigfoot. Many people that have seen, and keep in mind that not a lot of people get a good look at the face because they're nocturnal. They're typically moving away from humans, as in the Patterson film. They're so elusive and fast. I know there are accounts of them looking in windows and peeking around trees, but not a lot of people have the face-to-face encounters. A lot of different descriptions, but most people are on the edge. They say, well, it looked like a very human-like gorilla, or it looked like a very ape-like human. So it's basically a mixture of human and ape-like characteristics, right? The interesting feature I think that's reported a lot is the nose. People describe the nose as being hooded like ours. It's very wide and flat, but the nostrils face downward. And that's important, right? Because gorillas and orangutans and other apes, the nostrils are forward-facing, but in humans, hominins, our nostrils face downward. Do their eyes glow in the dark? Everyone's kind of stumped here. You hear a lot of accounts, right, of their eyes glowing in the dark. The proper translation of that would be, do their eyes reflect? Because there's no animal that has self-illuminating lights. Unless you think Bigfoot is a supernatural thing, which some people do, then their eyes reflect in the light. Now, eyes that reflect the light in the animal kingdom include animals that are nocturnal, primarily moving around at night. Animals that are nocturnal have an extraocular membrane, a little tissue in their eye called a tapetum lucidum. It's basically like a reflector that utilizes or maximizes the low light levels. So if Bigfoot is a nocturnal primate, and by the way, the only other primates that have a tapetum lucidum are like the prosimians, things like tarsiers, galagos, things like that. But if Bigfoot is nocturnal, which we think Bigfoot is nocturnal based on the sightings, then yes, its eyes might reflect a little bit in the light. Now, the one and only time when I think I may have seen a Bigfoot's eyes reflecting, it was a yellowish-greenish color, which is what you typically see on most animals. Some people have reported red reflecting eyes. It's not impossible because, sometimes if you shine a light on your dogs or your cats in the right angle, they look kind of reddish too. So it's just a matter of interpretation. Do they smell bad? They do? Would you be surprised to learn that analyzing over 1,000, 1,500 Bigfoot accounts, a bad smell is only reported 5 to 14% of the time. It's not always reported. They don't always smell bad, okay? 5% is the low end, and that's for the Pacific Northwest. The 14% comes from Florida, where we have an especially smelly version of Bigfoot known as the skunk ape. Now, there are a number of environmental factors why a Bigfoot might smell bad. Poor hygiene, their environment, living in a swamp, perhaps they feed on carrion. But moreover, I think it's worth noting that gorillas have glands in their armpits called apocrine glands. And they're basically axillary sweat glands. And a 2014 study found that gorillas can literally turn that smell off and on. Has anyone ever been to the zoo and you smell the gorillas and you're like, woo? Or other primates, marmosets, different other. So primates are capable, many primates are capable of emitting a bad smell as a defense mechanism. So it's a fair assumption that Bigfoot, like gorillas, may be able to turn on this horrific smell in certain instances where it feels defensive. But we have to keep in mind that Bigfoot doesn't always smell bad, because a lot of times the media will try to sell, oh, they always smell horrible. Well, not always. Some people don't smell it at all. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the morphology of the foot. Let me check and see how I'm doing on time. Okay, I can slow down a little bit. I'm just feeling I was doing. Okay. Oh, hi, Uncle Jerry. That's Uncle Jerry. I can call him Uncle Jerry because I've become friends with one of his nephews, Carl Crew. So Jerry Crew, of course, is famous for finding and casting some casts in Bluff Creek, California in October of 1958. Those subsequently a picture was taken and there was a story published in the Humboldt Times newspaper. And that was the first time anyone had ever heard the name Bigfoot. That was the name that the locals were using to describe these creatures. So the Bigfoot footprints and casts are obviously the most compelling physical evidence that we have. If anyone ever tells you, if any of your skeptic friends say, well, there's no physical evidence of Bigfoot. You take a Bigfoot cast And like Rene DeHinton used to say, you say, well, what if I hit you in the head with this cast? Would that be physical, or is that not physical? I'm not sure. So yes, we have casts and tracks. There have been thousands of footprint events that have been documented, photographed. There are obviously guys like Grover Krantz and Dr. Jeff Meldrum that have 300 plus casts, and those guys are physical anthropologists that specialize in primate anatomy and biolocomotion. So they know their stuff, and they've studied these footprints, and they found them to be very compelling evidence. So let's talk about the footprints. All right, game show time. When was the first footprint cast made? Anybody? It's a kind of a tricky question. Does anyone want to? No one wants to stick their neck out there? Well, most people would tell you, well, that was Jerry Crew in October of 1958. That's the very first Bigfoot cast that was ever made. But in fact, a little known secret, there was a cast made at Ruby Creek in British Columbia in 1941. Has anyone ever heard of the Ruby Creek incident? It's a very famous Bigfoot encounter. Okay, John Green investigated it, Rene DeHinton in the late 1950s. There was a family that encountered a Sasquatch on their property in Ruby Creek, British Columbia in 1941. And up to that time, Sasquatch was considered by a lot of Westerners to be basically a Native American myth. However, there were a number of people that showed up at the location in 1941 after this encounter, and they found footprints, and there was a sheriff's deputy named Joe Dunn from Bellingham, Washington, and in 1941 he was a Bigfoot investigator. So he was one of the real pioneers that we've never heard of. And Sheriff's Deputy Joe Dunn heard about this Bigfoot encounter at Ruby Creek, and he went up there, investigated in July of 1941, and he made a plaster cast. And the footprints were not photographed, but they were later sketched out. And John Green, when he went to Bluff Creek, California in 1958 to look at the Bigfoot tracks that were being found on the logging roads, realized that the tracks he was looking at there were identical to the tracks that had been seen and cast at Ruby Creek, British Columbia in 1941. So that was the very first time when we would actually make that connection, an obvious connection between British Columbia Sasquatch, California Bigfoot, right? It's the same thing. Now, sadly, nobody knows what happened to the Bigfoot cast from 1941. It's been lost in time, but man, wouldn't that be awesome to have a Bigfoot cast from 1941? Okay, so based on our data set and our statistical analysis, how big are Bigfoot footprints? Anyone want to take a guess? Don't be shy. Yes, sir. 14 inches? Reasonable guess. Anyone else? Okay, well, I said a moment ago that Patty from the Patterson film, her tracks are 14 and a half inches, okay? Her foot was 14 and a half inches. The one Jerry Crew is holding there in his hands, that's the original Bigfoot, that was 16 inches, okay? Found in the same vicinity as Patty's. But based on statistical analysis by John Green and Dr. Henner Fehrenbach, the average Sasquatch Bigfoot track is 15 and a half inches long and about 7 inches wide, 7.2. They obviously have a different foot morphology than us, right? Everybody here should know this. You say, well, if you look at a Bigfoot cast, well, it's a big human footprint. Well, no, it's not a big human footprint. It has no arch whatsoever. It displays more flexibility than a human foot. Dr. Jeff Meldrum could explain this better than I can, but they supposedly have a very thick sole of tissue under their foot. They have something called a mid-tarsal break or a medial hinge, which is a mid-foot flexibility. They can curl their toes. So, and of course, what's really amazing about that is that the Bigfoot foot, which has been studied via all these casts and prints, is exactly what Bigfoot would have to have if it weighed 800 pounds and it was walking around on its two legs all day. It would need that type of flexibility, that type of foot to walk around. So that's the average size. Now, what do we have in the hominoid world? We have sexual dimorphism. So this is my opinion, but in my own opinion, the largest length for any Bigfoot track is going to be about 18 inches long, maybe 19 inches if you're talking about a really huge animal. And as physical anthropologists often point out, footprints are not always the exact size of the foot because there's a lot of dynamics there in terms of the way it's stepping, the substrate, the angle, and velocity, and all those different variables. So I have an 18-inch Bigfoot cast over on my table there that was cast by a guy named Bob Titmus in California in 1963. I noticed that my friend Jerry Hestan had a huge track over on his table. It was about 18 inches. I'm very skeptical if researchers or people bring me casts that are larger than 18 or maybe 19 inches. I've seen people that have produced 24, 22-inch tracks. Guys, based on the calculation, and again, this is a ratio based on the size of Patty's foot compared to her body. If a Sasquatch, the 18-inch track that's going to be your 9-foot Sasquatch. If someone shows you a track that's 22, 24 inches long, now you're talking about a Bigfoot that's 12 or 15 feet tall. And again, we just can't, those accounts are rare. And no disrespect for anyone out there that thinks that they might get that tall, but I just don't think they're capable of getting 10, 12, 15 feet tall. So I think looking at the evidence of Bigfoot tracks, it's good for us to have a cutoff point, right? So 18, 19 inches is a pretty safe cutoff point, and that produces our 8.5, 9-foot Bigfoot or Sasquatch. Okay, so let's talk about ecology. Hope I'm not going... Okay, we got about 15 minutes. We'll make it. All right, so talking about ecology here, this is an important question that we all have to... If we believe that Bigfoot exists, if we convinced Bigfoot exists, then we have to estimate what type of breeding population they have, right? Because they've been around for thousands or millions of years. So this is it's really just speculation, guys. That's what we do. But there have been some scientific methods that have been used to try to determine how many Bigfoots or Sasquatches there are. Anyone want to take a guess? How many do you think there are? And then we're talking about all of North America here, right? 4,000. That's a pretty good guess, and we'll come back to that in a minute. Yes, sir. 12 to 15. Okay, well, ambitious. We don't know. Obviously, we really don't know. But based, again, on scientific academic methodologies, there would have to be a very minimum, in order for Bigfoot to survive, 1,500 to 4,000 individuals across North America. 4,000 was the number that Dr. Grover Krantz speculated. I work with the San Antonio Zoo in San Antonio, Texas, and we have very successful breeding programs in San Antonio Zoo for different... We've helped save the whooping crane from extinction in the 1950s. We're very active in breeding. And what I've learned working with different conservation groups is that once any species gets below 1,500, it's critically endangered. It's on the verge of extinction. So you have to have a certain amount of genetic variation and diversity within a population for it to survive. Now, you might get away with less in terms of something like a gorilla, which doesn't have a huge habitat, but we're talking about Bigfoot. It's got a huge habitat, so 1,500 would spread across North America. That would be pretty dire. So I think 4,000 is a better guess. A couple weeks ago, I had a conversation with Dr. Meldrum, and he had an interesting way of postulating population. He said, well, back in the 1960s, we found the Bigfoot tracks of the same individual that were like 40 to 60 miles apart. So that would infer a range of about 1,000 square miles if we use orangutans as a model. Male orangutans have a territory that they mark out, and the females travel in and out of that territory. Most other competing males are forced out of that territory, right? So if we use orangutans as a model, knowing the range of this one Sasquatch in the late 60s, we can estimate, Jeff estimated that there were about 75 Bigfoots in his state of Idaho, okay? Idaho is a well-forested state, and so if we extrapolate that across North America, then and just looking at forested areas, now the population of Bigfoots goes up to about 6,000. So we all have to be on board with this as Bigfoot enthusiasts, investigators. If anyone tells us, well, how many are there? There's not one. There's a few thousand. There have to be a few thousand of them out there. And it's really not that unbelievable when you consider, how much habitat we're talking about across North America, right? Okay, he turned me up, but I'm going to turn my mid-range down. I'm an audio engineer here too, so I can... Okay, there we go. Get rid of that nasty ring. What do they eat? The simple answer is everything. Bigfoot is most likely a generalist omnivore, like a bear. And in fact, bears, which we have obviously have healthy populations of bears here in North America, 3 species, right? Using bears as a model, bears are a very strong, are living proof essentially that Bigfoot could exist because we think they have very similar diets. Bigfoots have been described eating plant matter, roots, leaves, berries, nuts, but they're omnivores because people have also reportedly seen them eating deer, small animals, fish, mussels, and mollusks. So in terms of a caloric intake, a Bigfoot would probably need about 5,000 calories a day because it's got a high metabolism, it's very active. So Bigfoot would be eating a lot. And I think bears, again, wherever you have a healthy population of bears, black or brown, you usually have a lot of populations of Bigfoot. Now, a biologist would bring that into question and say, well, then you have direct competition between Bigfoot and bears. Well, in my own mind, I think that Bigfoot and bears have figured out a way to work this out. First of all, Bigfoots are very rare compared to bears. But many bears, for example, brown bears, are diurnal. They're mostly active during the day. If Bigfoot's nocturnal and mostly active at night, then those 2 species have basically come to an agreement. Okay, you go out during the day, eat what you can, I'm going to come out at night. They utilize a unique locomotor system. Again, their walk in the Patterson film has been analyzed. It's different from humans. The Patterson film was also analyzed by 2 biolocomotion experts, a guy named Donald Grieve in England and a Russian guy named Dmitry Donskoy. Both of them experts in how humans and primates walk, and they both came to the same conclusion, that Bigfoot does not walk exactly like a human. And all of you have realized, if you've seen the Patterson film, the knees are always bent at least at a 15-degree angle. The arm swing is more exaggerated. They kind of pull themselves. They walk kind of flat-footed. Very efficient. It's a very efficient walk. And many people that have seen Bigfoots walking say that it looks like they're gliding, that they're moving very fast. They don't bob up and down like humans do. They kind of just sail through, kind of like cross-country skiing. And this is my own theory, but I think Bigfoots, when people ask, well, why haven't we found one? My own personal opinion is that they have adapted behavior patterns specifically to avoid humans. They view us as their direct competition. We're hominoids, they're hominoids. Homo sapiens, us, through direct competition, we basically wiped Neanderthals off the face of the planet, perhaps some other species, Denisovans and whatever. So they know that we're their most competition, which is why they avoid contact with us. Hence, they live in the most remote areas we don't go. They're very nomadic and nocturnal, and we'll talk about that. So again, Bigfoot, based on their behavior patterns, most of the sightings are of individuals, right? Which are probably, speculating here, males that are searching for new habitats and territories. So if you think about an animal that is very intelligent, that's mostly solitary, that mostly nocturnal, living in the remote wilderness, moving around a lot, it would have a fair chance of avoiding human contact, and that's what I think these things are capable of. They communicate using a wide variety of vocalizations. People have described whistles, whoops, moans, screams, grunts. You've probably heard the Sierra sounds. I mean, those are pretty creepy kind of vocalizations. I've heard a few of those, but so yeah, some Bigfoot investigators have told me that they're skilled mimics, that they make really good, that they can imitate other animals. But this is a primate, again, a primate characteristic. All primates, from gorillas and apes, monkeys, humans, all of us communicate with a lot of vocal signals and sounds and so forth. So that would be fair to presume. They possibly signal to each other or to us by manipulating trees and branches. And of course, we have the infamous wood knocks. No one's ever seen well, I've heard one account of an actual wood knock taking place, but, and of course, many of us have found these weird things in the forest that look like markers or things that have things laid under. Now again, we don't have a lot of direct evidence that Bigfoot is responsible for making these different markers and formations. But just to use a personal anecdote, I was in Florida, in the Green Swamp, investigating skunk ape sightings back in 2004, and I found a bunch of, in an area where we'd had a lot of sightings or activity, I found 4 different formations where large branches or small trees had been laid into the forks of other trees, and they were all pointing in the same direction, about 50 yards apart. So I basically just followed that trajectory, and after the 4th formation, I found a little pond that was completely obscured by brush. So I'm just theorizing here, but I thought, man, that almost seems like it was like some signs pointing to that pond saying, oh, there's some water over there. But again, I'm just kind of guessing there. Rock throwing and aggression towards humans. Of course, been another common thing that's reported. Now, I know the Fouke monster in the Legend of Boggy Creek is portrayed as this highly aggressive towards humans. And I think a lot of that is probably true in terms of some of the encounters. But by and large, looking at the data, Bigfoot is obviously not an aggressive animal, right? It's usually moving away from humans. Look at Patty in the Patterson film. It wants no contact with humans. But like all animals, they are probably territorial and could be aggressive if you surprise them or corner them or if they have young. So man's best friend is not Bigfoot's and vice versa. And the obvious thing I mean by this is that dogs, for whatever reason, many accounts of dogs being afraid, cowering, afraid to, even tracking dogs, afraid to track, cowering under houses, sometimes being aggressive, and of course many accounts of Bigfoot's killing dogs, attacking dogs, and so on and so forth. So that's an interesting dynamic. Maybe that has something to do with the human direct competition. If dogs are our best friends, then Bigfoot views them as an enemy. Okay, so what is Bigfoot? Well, Jerry talked about Gigantopithecus. You guys have probably heard all of these before, but you have Gigantopithecus, Paranthropus, Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, Homo neanderthalensis. These were all hominoids that lived within the Pleistocene in the last ice age. And I think this is an argument that's often overlooked. Because when your skeptic friends say to you, well, Bigfoot doesn't exist, you can say, well, it did exist. Things that looked exactly like Bigfoot did exist. We have fossil evidence that they did. So maybe now the game has changed a little bit, right? Okay, maybe we can't prove they exist now, but based on these fossils. Now, I don't have a personal preference here in terms of a theory, because none of them fit the model perfectly. I know a lot of people say Gigantopithecus. You guys probably know this, but they've never found any post-cranial remains of Giganto, only jawbones and teeth. So they really don't know what its body looked like, if it was a biped, if it was a quadruped. I like to bring up an unknown called Hominid X. And what I mean by that is I'm not sure we've ever found fossil evidence of a Bigfoot. Because if you follow the news, paleoanthropologists are discovering new hominoids all the time. Just last year, Homo ludonzensis, the Denisovans, Homo floresiensis, Homo naledi, all of those were discovered in the past 15 years. So there are so many different types of pre-human forms, hominoids, that have lived. We don't know all of them. There's no way that fossils, as you know, are very chance things. We don't always find fossils of every species. So Bigfoot may be something we haven't discovered yet. But the point here is, things that look like Bigfoot, robust hominoids that walked on their hind legs, they did exist, definitively. So now we only have to make a case that they're still around, right? Where are the remains? By the way, an interesting side story here. These are pictures of the Minnesota Iceman here on the right. The Minnesota Iceman actually made a visit here to Fouke, Arkansas in 2013. I don't know if any of you knew that. But Lila and I appeared on a show called Shipping Wars, and they did an episode where they brought the Iceman down from Minnesota to Texas, and we stopped in Fouke. And I thought when we got to look at the Iceman as it was being transported, I thought, man, wouldn't this be a great sci-fi movie if the Iceman thawed out and the Fouke monster stepped out and they had this great battle, right? Fouke monster versus the Minnesota Iceman. Would anybody watch that? I know I would. Okay. All right, so why haven't we found any remains? It's a fair question. It seems like we should have more remains or some remains, but these are my arguments of why we haven't. Bigfoot is rare. We've already established that. There aren't very many of them. Now, this is important. Apex predators, animals that are at the top of the food chain like bears, mountain lions, wolves, we never find their remains. One of my best friends was a bear management officer in Yosemite for years. He said, that was our job, was to track all the bear population. We never found one dead. They would just disappear and vanish. Why is that so? Because when apex predators are sick or know they're about to die, what do? They hide. They crawl under the low brush somewhere where they're not found, and they die, and maybe that's where the remains stay. Now, you can take this a step further, and many people think that if they're intelligent enough, and if they're able to, that they bury their own dead somehow. It's possible. Neanderthals buried their own dead. Homo naledi, a hominid that was discovered in Africa recently, seemingly placed several of their own dead individuals into a hidden cavern. So it's possible that when they can, they might hide their own remains. Again, trying to avoid human competition. Let's hide from them. Animal remains vanish quickly in the wilderness. You guys have all heard these analogies. A full-grown elk carcass can disappear in 72 hours in the Pacific Northwest. Scavengers come in, insects, birds, coyotes, mice scatter the bones because they crave the calcium. So it is very hard to find some animal remains. And again, fossilization is a very rare occurrence. We don't always find fossils of every species. So we would hope that we had found remains, but we haven't yet. Okay, I'm almost done. And there have likely been some missed opportunities. I'm sure there have been instances out there where Bigfoot has been killed, like the Minnesota Iceman perhaps. I'm personally not an advocate of conspiracy theories, so if anyone, and I'm not trying to be argumentative, but people often, well, the government has one. Yeah, they're doing an autopsy. Maybe, I don't know. I don't have a lot of faith in our government these days, so I don't really think that they are capable of hiding something like a Bigfoot. But if you look at Asia, there are a lot of accounts. The Vietnamese rock apes, China, Russia, there are several accounts, particularly during wartime, where Bigfoots have supposedly been captured or killed. But because the people that killed it were in the middle of a war, they didn't really have time to do anything with it. They just kind of, All right, and this is my last one, and this is just a completely subjective exercise here, but I think it's important to always pay tribute to the forefathers, the pioneers of Bigfoot research, the Trailblazers. And there's a few of them that I would rank, and a lot of these names are being forgotten, and I think that's why it's important for us to recognize them. So in my own opinion, these are the most prolific Bigfoot investigators, and I break this down in terms of evidence produced. What did they bring to the table as far as footprint evidence, hair samples, documentation, so on. Patterson and Gimlin, number one on my list. They've got the film. I know the film's not conclusive, but we're still being able to draw evidence from that. They also cast some footprints that were left behind. Roger Patterson, we all love Bob Gimlin. I mean, he's an incredible ambassador to the Bigfoot field. Great guy, salt of the earth. Roger Patterson was a pretty bad bleep investigator. That's why he captured the film, because he had trained himself. He had the camera mounted with his saddlebag open so that if they did come across a Bigfoot, he would be able to pull it out. And guys, what did he do? He ran towards it. I don't know, as much as most of us love the topic of Bigfoot, when you're in that moment and there is a Bigfoot, would you have the gumption to grab the camera and start running at it? That's what he did, and that's why he got the footage. Patterson was a great investigator. Very sad that he passed early. Bob Titmus, the guy on the right-hand side here. Bob Titmus never wrote any books. He rarely was on TV, so a lot of people don't know who he was. But he was the one that told Jerry Crew to cast the very first Bigfoot cast, showed him how to do it. He, in the minds of John Green and Grover Krantz and others, Titmus produced some of the best casts. I've got a Titmus cast at my table if you guys want to look at it. Through the years, he cast, casts, hair samples, but Titmus was a great resource. Paul Freeman is a very controversial name in the Bigfoot film. Paul, to his own admission, did fake some footprints. So a lot of people say, well, you got to throw all of his stuff out because he faked some footprints. Well, he faked footprints because he was desperate, because people were all saying he was crazy and nuts. But Paul Freeman he cast some footprints that have been examined by Grover Krantz, Jeff Meldrum, and a forensic police fingerprint expert named Jimmy Chilcutt. And all three of those gentlemen said that there are actual dermal ridges or skin ridges in those casts. Freeman also produced possibly the second best Bigfoot film. If anyone's ever seen the Freeman footage, it's controversial, but Freeman was definitely a Bigfoot whisperer. He had a knack for finding evidence, but he did fake a few things by his own admission. Of course, the great René de Hinden, Swiss-born. He spent 40 plus years investigating Bigfoot. The only real drawback and the only demerit I give to René Dahinden is he never shared any of his research. He kept it all to himself. He really just wanted to make a fortune. That was his plan. I'm going to prove Bigfoot exists, and I'm going to be rich. And early on, he partnered up with John Green, but then they had a parting of ways because John Green was giving away all of the research to everybody that wanted it. But René Dahinden wouldn't do that. To René's credit, he was very skeptical, and he would always call BS first. He never had a sighting in 40 years of investigating Bigfoot in the wilderness. I've never really had a sighting. I've heard some things. I've seen some eyes shine. But when people ask me if I've ever seen Bigfoot, I'm like, no, I haven't. But I'm in pretty good company with René Dahinden and also John Green, Mr. Sasquatch. And John Green, of course, accumulated thousands of Bigfoot sightings and published books that disseminated that information around the world. And then finally, the last of the great four horsemen of Bigfoot research, Peter Byrne, who's still alive. He's 93. I had the great pleasure of meeting him a couple of years ago. And Peter Byrne actually started by tracking the Yeti in the Himalayas in 1956. And then his good buddy Tom Slick, who was a millionaire, brought him over to California to take over. And truth be told, a lot of these guys didn't like each other. And one last closing thing here, because people often bring this up to me and they say, well, I don't like being in the Bigfoot field. There's a lot of fighting, and there's a lot of politics and a lot of fighting, and it leaves a bad taste in my mouth. Well, guys, it's always been that way. And the reason it's always been that way was pointed out by John Green, who once wrote, the average Bigfoot investigator is pig-headed. You take any individual that's going to go out and try to prove that a mythological animal exists, it's going to be a pretty stubborn individual that has a very set way of doing things and a very strong opinion. And so most Bigfoot investigators are a little bit pig-headed and a little bit hard for them sometimes to work with others. So we're always going to have that situation, but maybe not so much these days because, like I said, I work with a lot of Bigfoot investigators around the country, and a lot of them are really outstanding people that are willing to share their information and to work together. So if we all keep working together, maybe we can solve this mystery someday. Anyways, I think I'm at the end of the line. Appreciate your time. Like I said, my new book will be out in September. We'll have this information and a lot more. And I'll be at my table all day if you guys want to stop over. If you've got a question, a comment, or something I didn't discuss here, I'd be happy to talk about it with you. So, all right. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Thank you.